Hello, and welcome back to Just the Facts, ma'am. This is the 5th episode. Today is April 5th, 2025, and as promised, or at least hoped in the last episode, I have my first guest speaker who is near and dear to my heart because not only is he my dad, but he is a distinguished judge, having served honorably on the bench for 45 years. This is the Honorable Judge V. Hall.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. In addition to his distinguished career on the bench, he also had a gangbuster start to his legal life because not 5 minutes after he was sworn in as an attorney, he filed a lawsuit that eventually found its way to the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you, spoiler alert, they found in his favor. To read more about that case, you can look up Hall versus Beals, or you can go to the Pikes Peak Library District Story Project and look up Richard Hall. And another fun fact is, if you're going to watch that, the child with whom my mom was pregnant during this whole time, you're looking at her. All right, so because he's a Supreme Court and legal expert, today's topic is everything that you could want to know, or at least the general overview of the Supreme Court. Okay, we're going to do this like a question and answer session. So question number 1 is, how was the Supreme Court created?
When the United States first came into existence in 1776, after the Declaration of Independence, there was no Supreme Court. There was no national government. We were just a confederation or grouping together of individual sovereign states. The Supreme Court came into existence in 1789 when the Constitution was adopted. The Constitution under Article 3 says there shall be one Supreme Court and such other courts as Congress may establish.
The Constitution specify the number of justices. We've all heard about the packing of the court.
The Constitution does not specify how many justices may be on the Supreme Court, and as a result, the number has moved up and down over the years, sometimes for partisan political reasons and sometimes for practical reasons. It originally started with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. There was a concern that that might lead to tie votes, so in 1807 it was increased to 7. Then in 1837, it was increased to 9. This was for the practical reason that new states had come into the nation after the original 13, and the intermediate circuit courts of appeal were at that time staffed by 2 justices from the Supreme Court and the local district court judge. The Supreme Court justice had to travel to where the new circuit courts were located. Given the primitive road system and the long distance to travel, the justices did not like that duty at all. It was called riding circuit. So the Supreme Court increased the total justices to 9 to provide just additional justices to help with that. Then, immediately after the Civil War, the number was decreased to 7 to prevent President Johnson, who himself was unpopular at the time, having been impeached but not convicted. The Congress wanted to limit his authority to add new justices, so they reduced the number to 7. After he left office and President Grant came in, they increased the number back up to 9 so that Grant could make appointments. Then in the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt was concerned the Supreme Court was overturning much of his New Deal legislation, so he proposed a plan to add a new justice to the Supreme Court to assist with the workload, so to speak. 1 new justice for every justice at the time that was over the age of 70. There were 6 justices over the age of 70, which would have meant 6 new appointments, all of which would have been by President Roosevelt, presumably favorable to him, and therefore the court would be more favorable in upholding his legislation. That plan created a huge controversy, even though President Roosevelt himself was very popular, elected by a landslide in 1936. The country didn't like the idea of tinkering with the Supreme Court for political partisan reasons. So there was a controversy. The court packing plan eventually went away when the court itself, with its then existing members, started to uphold President Roosevelt's New Deal legislation. That's referred to as the switch in time that saved 9. So the court was not packed, and it's remained 9 justices ever since.
All right, next question. What is the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court?
The Constitution, Article 3, says that the Supreme Court shall have 2 kinds of jurisdiction. In cases where a state is itself a party to the lawsuit, the court has what's called original jurisdiction. So the lawsuit can be filed directly in the Supreme Court and not go through any process in lower courts. Otherwise, in all other cases, the Supreme Court has appellate jurisdiction. This distinction was crucial in a very important Supreme Court case way back in 1803, as the country was just getting established, Marbury versus Madison. Mr. Marbury filed his lawsuit directly in the Supreme Court because he wanted a quick answer to his question, and a piece of legislation from the Senate had said that he could. But the Supreme Court held that no, he can't file it directly in the Supreme Court because that's original jurisdiction. His kind of lawsuit conflicted with the provision of the Constitution, and therefore the statute that he relied upon was unconstitutional. And that's where the concept of declaring acts of Congress or other official governmental acts unconstitutional came from.
And is it correct to say that that is what clearly defined the Constitution as the supreme law of the land?
Yes, that phrase appears exactly as that in the case of Marbury versus Madison. The Constitution is the supreme law of the country.
Okay, interesting. Next question. Can Supreme Court justices be impeached? And if so, have any ever been?
Yes, in 1804, Samuel Chase was impeached by the House. He was a Federalist, what we would call a Republican now. He allegedly had made seditious comments about John Adams and what were then called Republicans, which we would now think of as Democrats. He was impeached, but he was not convicted, so he was not removed from office. After the school desegregation case in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, there were billboards all over the South asking to impeach Earl Warren. Never happened, but there was a lot of talk about it. William Douglas, a liberal on what was then a conservative court, was discussed for impeachment. When I had my case before the Supreme Court, there were only 8 justices on the court because the 9th Justice, Justice Fortas, had resigned after having been accused of questionable financial dealings in Las Vegas. So there have been talk of justices being impeached. One was, but he was not convicted.
Is the process of impeaching a Supreme Court justice the same in terms of Congress is the one who actually does it?
Yes, the House adopts articles of impeachment, which are the charges against the person. Then there is a trial in the Senate and a vote taken, and that's what would result in a conviction and actual removal from office.
All right, next up, what are the requirements to be a Supreme Court justice?
Surprisingly, there are no requirements stated in the Constitution. There's no requirement, for example, that you have to be a lawyer. Everyone has been a lawyer. A few justices, such as Robert Jackson in 1943, didn't go to law school. They rather read the law. There's no requirement that you have been a judge. Earl Warren was governor of California. 3 justices were senators, 2 justices were former attorneys general of the United States, 1 justice was Solicitor General of the United States, that's the person who argues cases before the Supreme Court, and former dean of the Harvard Law School. The composition of the court has also become more diversified over the years. The first Catholic on the court was Roger Taney in 1836. The first Jew was Louis Brandeis in 1916. The first African American was Thurgood Marshall in 1954. The first woman was Sandra Day O'Connor, 1981. And the first Latina was Sonia Sotomayor in 2008.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Remember to look at the document below for the updated price trends of gas, milk, and eggs. I'll see you next month. I just have one last question for you.
Megan, you are surely my favorite oldest daughter. Always have been, and you always will.
And you're my favorite, Dad.